this year, and then I was newly elected to be the treasurer-elect for this upcoming year. And then my current role is at the Oklahoma State Department of Education as one of their crisis team school psychologists.
Perfect, thank you. And then Jackie.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many of you on here. I'm Jackie Johns, and I am on this crisis team, of course. I was the Eastern Region representative this past year, and then next year I'm the president-elect for OSPA. In my day-to-day role, I'm a certified school psychologist and district mental health coordinator and special education coordinator at Collinsville Public Schools.
Perfect, thank you, Jackie. Erica.
Good morning, everybody. Erica Ollinger, and I'm the NASP delegate on the board and the other OSDE crisis team school psychologist.
Perfect. And Catherine.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Moore, and I have served as the secretary on the OSPA board in the past, and I'm currently on the communications committee. I'm the co-chair along with Brittany Stein. And day to day, I work in a private practice setting as a licensed psychologist and school psychologist.
Perfect, thank you. Jackie, I'm going to throw our order off a little bit. Do you want to go ahead and do just the general kind of Zoom meeting, rules of engagement, and that piece?
Sure. Yep, of course. So again, thank you guys all for joining us. I know we all have a lot of Zoom meetings and a lot of things on our plate, but we're glad to have you here. So just sort of some of those Zoom meeting norms is if you can all make sure to mute your mics. It looks like most, if not all of you, have already gotten that down. So just make sure they're muted, please, when you're not speaking. If you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box, just say what your name is, you know, what your role is, where you work, so we have a little bit better sense of who all is here with us today. And then if you have any questions, of course, you can feel free to just ask them, but if you want, you can put them in the chat box as well, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the meeting today so we can make sure that we get to all of your questions.
Perfect, thank you. And we do, so the kind of the format for today is we are going to talk a little bit about some upcoming things, answer some of the questions that you all had posted when you registered. And then also we're going to focus on the crisis response of how is our role going to change next year with the crisis response and that postvention for our students and our staff coming back after this break, and what that's going to look like. So let's see, Erica, do you want to pull back up the presentation to show the upcoming meetings and that piece of it? So you guys can go ahead and mark your calendars. We're going to have 4 more of these meetings throughout the summer, and really based off of the feedback that we received from you all in the last session, as well as the survey that we sent out, these are the topics that we have heard your information of. These are things that you want to know more about. So on June 10th, we're going to be introducing, yay, the new NASP standards. So hopefully you saw the emails that NASP every 10 years updates their standards. And so those have come up, but we're going to focus it on how do you apply those things with this current situation with COVID-19? And we're really looking forward to hearing from everyone about their creative solutions and the things that they're doing for that. And we'll talk more about our spotlight of a school psychologist here in a little bit as well. And then best practice considerations for assessment and evaluation. I know that's a huge question on everyone's mind. So I can't tell you that we have the answers, but we're going to have that discussion as far as what does assessment and evaluation look like coming back when we have students that have missed now 3 months of school, but we also have deadlines and timelines to meet as well. And then in July, we're going to talk about the tele-intervention and progress monitoring strategies. Really important. What does RTI look like in this time? What happens when our schools, if they close again, or with these adjusted schedules? So we'll be talking about that piece of it. And then finally, some school reentry planning for school psychologists and some things, practical strategies for you before you take your first step back into the buildings in the fall. So right now we're going to focus more on the role of school psychologists in crisis prevention. So I'm going to turn it over to Erica and Trisha, who are our crisis prevention specialists at OSDE, and they're going to talk about what that means for you in the upcoming area. And then we're going to try to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion and questions after the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Again, this is Erica Olinger. One thing I want to emphasize too with those previous meeting dates, and we'll put those up at the end if you didn't get them all written down, but we hope to record all of these sessions. So I know it's summer, many of you won't be on contract and you may not be able to attend all of those meetings, but we're hoping to record them so that you can access them later. And the other thing that I would encourage all of you to do as members is to look at those topics. And if there's something that you feel that you can speak on, or your school team, or that you've developed resources for, we really want members to be talking to other members about the good things that they're doing. So please just email the committee and say, hey, we've developed some really great, tele-intervention strategies or whatever you're doing, because we are happy to present information, but we would really love, and I think your colleagues would love, to hear from the field. And so this is an active solicitation to submit topics for those meetings if you feel like you can present. So we're going to move on next into the role of school psychologists in crisis, postvention, and recovery. And many of you who know me know that crisis management is one of my practice and research interests, and I've been involved in that basically since my internship post Hurricane Katrina. And so it's something that I'm fortunately allowed to really focus on now in my new role. And Trish and I are both Prepare trainers, and we're updated in the most recent Prepare 3 curriculum. And a lot of this information comes from not just the Prepare curriculum itself, but the empirical evidence behind the curriculum and those resources. So a couple of generalized thoughts that I want you to just keep in mind is stop worrying about what can go wrong and get excited about what can go right. So it's hard to talk about crisis, and we are all certainly in a position where we're worried about things that can go wrong, as we should be. But I want to come at this through a lens of optimism and a strengths-based approach. So I want us all to just be optimistic as we go through some of this information. And the other thing I want us to take comfort in is that if you don't know everything, you just go with what you do know. So with a lot of things I'm going to be talking about, I hope will sound familiar to you, and a lot of your crisis response, while the situation feels uncertain, you all have excellent skills already that you can rely on, and you have knowledge of systems that you can rely on. And this is the new, by the way, graphic for the practice model, which we're going to be talking about in more detail. So the old, what we used to call the house that visually represented our practice model, will go away after July 1st, and this is the new one. But in uncertain times, the best thing that you can do is not feel like you have to recreate the wheel. Go with the wheel that we already have and utilize skills that are already in your toolbox and generalize them to new situations. By the way, I forgot to mention Sarah helped Trisha and I in developing some of these slides, so thank you to her for her contribution. But one of the things that we like to think about is that right now we're all in the same storm, meaning we are all navigating COVID-19 and what that means for us as individuals, as professionals, as folks acting as consultants to schools. And while we're all under the influence of COVID-19, the same storm, we're navigating it in different boats. And so you can see here, some people really don't have a lot of resources and means they're making it day by day, and they're like in a life raft or a dingy rowboat. Other people are just cruising along. They're making the best that they can of it, and they just feel like they're cruising and maintaining. Some folks feel like they're going to battle every day. And other folks are really having a time to shine and a time to thrive. And I think that it's important that we recognize that as we talk about our role in terms of crisis response. But real quick, just to have a piece of interaction, we're going to put up a quick poll. And I want everybody on the call, your responses will be anonymous, so we won't know. We're going to look at aggregated data only. But tell us, as Sarah's putting that up, if you had to pick your boat for how you're weathering the storm today, which would you pick? And I can't see. Sarah, is that up for people to respond?
Yes.
Okay,
So
no.
a poll should have popped up, and I also had the second question on there as well.
Okay,
So
you can answer
guys
the
can answer
second
both.
question as well, which is, have you found yourself in different boats at different times since March 13th? Oh, I can see it, sorry. So your choices are you a person in this moment today, May 21st? Are you in a cruise ship, a speedboat, battleship, tour boat, life raft, or rowboat, or I'm just treading water? And any of those are appropriate. And then have you found yourself in different spots when it's not May 21st, maybe earlier in the week or last month in a different spot? And I'll give you guys a couple minutes to think about it. And Sarah will post the results when she feels like she's had some good responding.
Yeah, we've got about 78%, but people are still responding, so we'll give it a few more seconds. We like high response numbers. Or keep going up. We've almost there. All right, it looks like I've got everyone that's gonna respond. So I will share those results. You guys should be able to see that. So it looks like majority of people said tour boat, which I think is interesting. So kind of, I don't know what, and we can do some call out what people think that means, but to me that means sort of watching the storm, and or maybe feeling like this boat was not made for this storm, but we've got a lot of people on it. And a lot of people, most said, yeah, definitely feeling like they're in a different boat. So.
Okay, so these results are telling, because what it tells me is that even as a pretty homogenous group, meaning professionals who are school psychologists, who are educated with training, we're all in different places right now. And we have been and will continue to be in different places. And I think that's one of my take-home messages for today, is that not everybody is handling COVID-19 or responding or functioning the same way. And I think it'll make more sense. My PowerPoint stuck here. It'll make more sense as we go along. So again, let's go back to what we know. And what we know when we talk about education and how we're providing services and interventions is that one size fits all is not appropriate. And that's true even in the light of COVID-19. So let me talk more about what I mean. What I mean is that, oh, sorry, I will talk more about what I mean, but what I want you to do when you're thinking about your roles is rely on the things that you already know in terms of your crisis response. So what do we all know very well? We know about an MTSS response. What does that mean? We know that if we can apply a framework, it's going to help us evaluate systems, identify student, staff, and needs. And remember, as our poll just indicated, those student and staff needs are going to look different, and then provide interventions matched to that need. So the same types of concepts that we've been talking about when we talk about academics or behavior also apply to a crisis response. So I'm going to share some tips for how to do universal screening, or what we call in the crisis world triage, tiered systems of support, interventions that are empirically based to help with crisis, and not just in the initial response, but in recovery, progress monitoring, and using data to make our decisions. So I get the prize for pulling up the first triangle for the day. But when I think of multi-tiered systems of supports, I don't think of a one-dimensional triangle, or even two triangles side by side, and one is labeled behavior and one is labeled academics. I really do think about sort of a multifaceted pyramid where one face of the pyramid and of MTSS is for academics. One might be for behavior. A third might be for SEL and mental health. And a fourth might be for crisis response. And all of those things work together in a true comprehensive MTSS support model. And we can utilize those same basic principles to guide us. Some of you may be surprised when I say this, but I think one of the dangers that we have to think about in school psychology is that the push right now, and I've seen it in so many places, is that we just can't focus on academics at all, or even behavior at all, that all we need to focus on is kiddos' mental health needs. And I think that's a mistake. I think previously, one of the concerns was that all schools did was focus on academics, and they ignored the behavior pieces and the mental health pieces, and they didn't give enough attention to those things. But I think it's dangerous to also just drop off our academics and our behavior pieces, because for whole child wellness and for appropriate functioning and development, all four have to work together. So I'm not saying we don't not attend to mental health and SEL needs, but we certainly keep in mind all of those processes and assess for true student needs instead of sacrificing one for the other. Let's talk a little bit more about that and why an MTSS approach is appropriate for crisis response. Well, as we just saw in our own small N poll here, not all individuals are going to be equally affected. What we know from the previous crisis literature, and when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about studies that were done post Hurricane Katrina, post Columbine, post 9/11, and even some work that was done in terms of Holocaust survivors. And what we know is that recovery is the norm. And so we make a mistake when we assume or we over pathologize what school is going to look like in the fall. I think it's a mistake for us to believe that everybody is going to be traumatized, or starting with the pathology-driven approach rather than a strength-based approach. Because what we know is that most people do have resiliency, and they're able to access resources and skills that enable them to move forward. I've seen some concerning things recently that speak, for example, about how every student currently in the world is going to have an ACE, or an adverse childhood experience due to COVID-19. And I think that's dangerous. I think that would be the same as saying that every student needs special education. And we know how frustrated we get when we don't recognize that the tier 3 piece, whether it's academics, behavior, or crisis response, really should be reserved for those that need that level of support. Also, if we focus just on those that need that level of support, that's going to allocate the appropriate amount of energy and resources to the students that do need it. Other things to consider that we know from the literature is that not everyone exposed to trauma either needs or wants help. So that should structure our response to the crisis in the schools. Crisis intervention should only be offered in response to demonstrated need. So the same way we match academic resources as tier 1, 2, or 3, behavior resources as tier 1 and 3, our crisis response and our recovery efforts for students and staff should only be offered or matched to need. And what we also know is crisis intervention can cause harm if we provide it to folks when it's not truly needed. So I like to say, for people who are breathing on their own, we don't put an oxygen mask on those folks because they're able to handle it. So I want to call out again and just ask, and just kind of put in your chat box, and Sarah can read them out to me. After seeing some of these things and recognizing them, what are some other ways that you feel providing a one-size-fits-all approach or a one-size crisis response would be damaging? So just put your thoughts in the chat.
So we're getting some, a few responses here. Secondary trauma, that's definitely one that I hear a lot of, where everyone has secondary trauma. Well, not necessarily.
Right.
Talk about it. the age and grade level, assuming things just based off of the age and grade level is another one. What else do you guys have? Students may think they are supposed to feel worse than they do. That's a huge one, and creates kind of going with that the victim mentality and that response. Absolutely. Different populations have different needs, different people, different levels of support. So we have to respond at the right time.
Yes, so all of those are appropriate, and you can continue to discuss that and share your ideas in the chat. But yes, all of those things. We want to be careful about self-fulfilling prophecies or that victim mentality. We want to be careful that sometimes if in our response, we might actually increase exposure to a crisis. The folks that were actually doing okay, it's almost like we make them worse or cause them to experience symptoms they didn't previously have. And also, as someone said, you know, if everybody around you, if you're making it feel like, oh, I'm the only one not having sleep problems, or I'm the only one that's not crying, then that really diminishes the person's ability to use their own problem solving and their own coping skills, because they switch from accessing those resources to wondering why they're not experiencing something. So in our crisis process, and this is a graphic from Prepare, and I'm just going to spend a second on this. A crisis event occurs. We do some things universally. So think tier 1 now, okay? Some things we do universally for all people, and that's to reinform physical health, ensure perceptions of safety and security. That's important because perception of a crisis is just as important as actual exposure. And then here's where we get into an evaluation piece. And this is what school psychologists are good at, is now let's kind of screen or universally look at what types of trauma are we experiencing. And that really helps us sort students and staff potentially into 3 groups: those that are at low risk for psychological trauma, moderate risk, and high risk. And then we can tailor and match to those needs the types of interventions that we're going to apply for low, moderate, or high risk. Another way to look at it that I'm sure you're all comfortable with is, again, in a triangle format. What I would suggest is one face of a multifaceted pyramid. In tier 1, the types of things you might consider for those students in terms of your initial response are things like caregiver trainings, classroom meetings, informational flyers. So things that help them to continue to navigate and to support what they're doing already. So again, it's not that we don't do anything. We just make sure that a solid tier 1 is in place and recognize that for some students, a majority of students, that's going to be sufficient. At tier 2, then you get a little bit more individualized, and you might run some small groups, some crisis intervention groups, or some classroom-based interventions, right? And so we might get a little bit more structured. We might look at who's experiencing what symptoms and group them that way, or who's lacking which resources and group them that way. So we're going to use some data to make that decision. And then, of course, there is going to be a group. I'm not suggesting that there won't be. There is going to be a group that's going to need something much more significant. It may look like therapy or prolonged types of services. But again, the better job that we do with this initial triage, the better job we can do at really saving our energy and resources for those that do need that tier 3 level of support. So the good news is, again, we're coming from a strength-based approach. Most staff and students are going to respond well to purposely crafted tier 1 levels of support. They're going to adjust, they're going to have some resiliency, and in fact, they're going to potentially demonstrate growth. I said I would offer some resources. These things are from the Prepare curriculum, and I'm happy to share with anybody who doesn't have them or who would like to access them. Or you could think about things that maybe you already have in place and buildings that you could help facilitate. When I'm speaking of universal screening, this form right here, which we call again a triage form or a psychological risk checklist, is one way to do that. This is something that you could do previous to school coming back, and you could give it to a student's previous teachers. You could have parents help you. Your problem solving teams could get together and look at this. You know, I know that everybody's sitting, in many schools are sitting down and doing class placements where everybody sits down and they talk about individual factors for students to determine class placements. You could do that similarly, but this really helps you have some data about things that we know. So over here, physical proximity, emotional, these things right here are things linked in the research that tell us about the potential for psychological trauma. So you could go through for students, check off these boxes, and it would help you determine which students are in that low, moderate, or high risk. Just like with any screener, you might get some wrong, right? You're going to do some further work and you found like you missed somebody, or maybe you put somebody in the wrong group, but having a plan for how to initially assess is really going to help structure your crisis response activities. That tier 1 support, I've talked about this. I'm going to not go in this in great detail for the sake of time, but the two main things are social support, or as Sarah likes to put it, making sure that people have their people. So just making sure that kids are able to reconnect in one way or another, virtually or with appropriate protocols in the schools, that they're able to see their teachers, that they're feeling safe in school, and that they have access to some routines. And we're going to always provide education as a tier 1 response, education related to COVID-19, hygiene, etc. In a moment, by the way, Trish is going to talk about social emotional learning that would also be, as in terms of recovery, your long-term plan after your initial response. Next, I just have some quick examples, again, of these are the types of forms then that you could use in a tier 2 database decision-making way for those students that you maybe indicated were moderate risk. You could gather some more information, and you can do this via, this is an example of a referral form that, again, a teacher or a parent or even some other older students could fill out themselves. That's going to help you get a sense of who goes in what group and what did the needs look like to provide intervention matched to those needs. This is another one. It's a primary risk screening. This one is a little bit simpler. It's kind of a yes, no, and it gives folks maybe a small chance to elaborate. But having these things in place, think of this as kind of your diagnostic that you do at tier 2 to help identify what skills do we need to work on for students in a systematic way. And again, those supports are going to look like your mental health first aid in the initial response, some crisis group interventions, and some individual crisis intervention types of things, but that are considered a moderate level of support. And this is, again, for the long term, for your recovery after your response in tier 2 supports. And these are the types of things that I hope school psychologists will really get involved in, because we have expertise here, a perfect place to collaborate with your school counselors or other mental health folks you may have in your district. And I know I'm going quickly, but again, just email me or the committee if you'd like access to some of these things. Moving into tier 3 then, this would be the appropriate time to those kids that you've identified and staff as high risk. Now we can start thinking about some of these screening tools. This is a list that is from the current Prepare curriculum, but I know that Castle and some other folks are updating it. But say that this kind of screening, or looking at issues this deeply, only for those that you've identified as high need. Don't be, passing out these as screeners at a universal level, because that's likely not appropriate. This is really for kiddos that we've identified those symptoms that make us think that they're high risk. And once again, the point of the screener is really then to guide your interventions and what your supports and your instruction will look like. And a lot of times these are your kiddos who are going to need significant supports that may include in-house mental health supports if your districts can accommodate that, and it may include some collaboration with your community and outside agency. These are kids that are looking for those tier 3 supports. So again, I think my point in all of this is that we all have, even though the times are uncertain, we have good schools, and we know how to manage our frameworks to ensure that students are getting what they need. And so, just be a skeptical consumer of a lot of the things that are coming out right now that say that everybody's going to be traumatized or everybody's going to need significant mental health supports in schools. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by that. I'd rather you just feel empowered by knowing that you have some skills and a tool set that can help people make reasonable decisions about what kinds of psychological support kids may need and may not need, and also how to capitalize on resiliency that humans have a tendency to naturally show, and to come at it from a strength-based approach rather than a pathology-based approach. This is one, I don't speak Chinese, I've always wished I did, but this is the word in Chinese for crisis. And it's actually, if you try to translate it, would be made up of 2 English words, and one is a time of danger. And I think we can all sense that. But the other is a time of opportunity. And that's the piece I would say is a huge playing factor and a huge role you can play as a school psychologist, is to help your teams and buildings capitalize on opportunity that is the part of any crisis. These can be things like rethinking what we've been doing and why, and changing ineffective systems. I don't know, maybe actually implementing some SEL curriculum in a tiered manner, an MTSS framework. Develop new skills for yourself and your staff. I know that I've just gotten so much better at Zoom meetings. Connecting with people differently, building new relationships, and just to keep improving. Identify what do we need to fix, and let's problem solve. School psychologists are problem solvers, so that can be a role for you. And ultimately, I think one of the things that you can really help with is use the materials and strengths and tools that you already have to help your buildings build a more suitable boat for the next storm. I'm just about to pass it on to Tricia. I just have a couple of closing thoughts, and one, this is, I think, something we shared on our page, where you could ask people right now, how deep is the mud? And they might say, well, it depends on who you ask. So it's important that we apply those principles and know that everybody's going through things differently, and we can't continue to assume a one-size-fits-all model. So before I pass it on to Tricia to go over some quick SEL resources, which will be critical for your long-term recovery plan, I just wanted a couple more quick polls. And again, I'm going to let Sarah or one of the other moderators help me. And the first one is, what are some examples of how you've seen students who've actually found ways to thrive in the wake of COVID-19?
And as people are typing, if anyone wants to unmute and just maybe share out a response too, we can do some that way as well.
Would be appropriate. Do we have some, Sarah?
Yeah, so we have one coming across from Natalie saying that they've had many secondary age students take this time to involve themselves in more philanthropy opportunities and outreach. So they have that time, I'm guessing, during the day now, so they can do some of those more charity type things, which is awesome. And I think a huge, it's building life skills. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've seen from a lot of, parents, that they're taking that opportunity of, hey, we don't have to necessarily focus on reading, writing, and math, but we can learn some more life skills right now and more outreach opportunities. So that's great.
Awesome. Other ideas from the field? A couple of things that I've seen some research on is that for some students, the reprieve from school has not actually been traumatic at all, but it's been a reprieve. They felt less social pressure. They aren't bullied anymore. They feel like they're actually able to perform well and exercise their skills and their autonomy without the trappings of social pressure. And they've done some studies that show there's a significant amount of students who feel that way. Speaking about my adolescents and my secondary folks, a lot of students are reporting that they're getting better sleep. And doesn't that make sense? Because speaking of an outdated practice, what we know from the sleep literature is that starting high school at 7:30 a.m. does not match the physiological needs of adolescents. And so they're able to be more efficient because they're getting better sleep. They like being able to log on and become efficient. As I think one of our folks from the field mentioned, if you're not forced to spend 8 hours in a building a day, you might have time to engage in some philanthropy work or other work. I also was in a discussion yesterday, and they were talking about if you're looking at the AP test data, a lot of kiddos now that they're virtual are actually choosing to take them in the middle of the night because they feel like that's when they're primed. And so we've seen, you know, less bullying, less social pressure, kids who are able to exhibit skills the way that they want to. And I know I felt this with my own family. One of the opportunities is just increased family time. And my husband and I have really changed our thinking about when we turn off our computers at night and how we engage our students. And in some ways we're kicking ourselves and saying, why weren't we doing this all along? We should have been taking daily walks around the neighborhood every day, not just because it's COVID-19. So I think families have some things. So I want you to just think about that. And then my last kind of thought for the day is, do you have examples, similar examples for how staff, and that can be teachers, your principals, your leaders, or especially you as school psychologists have found ways to thrive? So what are some of the opportunities or the ways that you have been able to shine or to thrive in the wake of COVID-19? And again, you can chat it in the box or just unmute and tell us.
Oh, I love this one. Micah Shelton saying that she's seen students teach grandparents how to use Zoom to have a family reunion.
I love that.
So that piece, and Michelle mentioning just that, you know, there's a lot of social pressure, and sometimes, I mean, middle school's not the most fun place to be, and so getting a break from some of that can actually be good for our students. Absolutely. Sherry Augustine saying that now she gets to see light because her office at school doesn't have a window, so
Exactly.
she gets some sunlight, which truly does help. I mean, that's a therapy in itself.
Mm-hmm. So I love this. I love this range of responses, that it can be something, I don't mean to minimize it, but something as seemingly small as, oh, I now have a comfortable office space with light, to as big as, hey, middle school is actually a lot better for students. And I want us to remember that, and also just to capitalize that as school sites, we have the opportunity to leverage some really important concepts right now. I think one of the ways that we can thrive is to update outdated practices, to show folks that we do have skills beyond just traditional assessment or traditional special ed roles. We really do have some opportunities here. And I hope you all recognize that I'm not minimizing what people are experiencing with COVID-19. And there are folks who are really struggling, and we need to be attentive to that. But I think it's also good for our mental health to recognize and to celebrate that some people are doing okay to better than okay. And so I know that was super quick, but I hope that gave you some tools. Before I pass on to Trisha, and she's going to talk less about the initial the initial response phase, and go into long-term recovery in terms of SEL practices that we should be implementing. I just want to leave you with a picture of one of my favorite flowers, which is the lotus. And I just want you to imagine, you know, that mud and that dirt and that gunk is COVID-19. And sometimes we all have to walk through it, and it's stinky and messy and horrible, but the lotus flower is one that can bloom in those conditions. And when it comes up and it breaks the surface of that mud, it's really usually entirely unmarked, and it's beautiful, and it rises above the dirt beneath it. And so I just want us all to remember that some people are shining, and we all have that potential. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Trisha, unless there were any pressing comments in the box I need to be attentive to, or questions.
No, I mean, I think people are making some excellent comments, so I encourage everyone to read it. And things about, you know, I love Natalie mentioned here that it gives us a chance to miss work, and you know, we get so burned out on the day-to-day, and now we get a chance to say, oh, what are the things I really miss, which is nice. So
that's awesome. Okay, keep the comments coming. If you have questions for me, either about this presentation or about other crisis response, we're going to give some contact info at the end. But now Trisha, if I can get it to go, is going to speak about SEL supports in the long-term recovery efforts from COVID-19.
Okay, so there's supposed to be another little graphic on here, but it's not showing up. So no, oh, there it goes. So we already saw this triangle before, and this is just another way of seeing it. So I know a lot of you have seen that umbrella. Uh-oh. Are you switching over? Okay. Hold on. Erica, are we switching screens?
I'm just kidding. I don't know a thing about Zoom. I forgot to unmute myself. I'm sorry. Can you see it now?
I can see it now. It just needs to be on presentation. There we go.
Okay, keep going. I'll get you there.
Sorry about that, guys.
It's my
Technical
fault.
difficulty.
Just read it again all really fast. This is just a quick review. Sorry, Trisha. There we go.
Hey, you're fine. You're no problem. And so we've probably seen this umbrella before, and usually it only has 3 of those circles. It has academic, behavior, and social emotional. And I'll talk about the social emotional part, but we added in crisis management because that is a passion of ours, and that we feel like it is a really valuable piece to that. And it can be implemented in that multi-tiered systems of support. Okay, here we go. So social emotional learning. So CASEL, which Erica mentioned before, is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And they're one of the leaders in this work in the nation. And so this is their quote about what it is, and then I'll talk about why it's important. But it's social emotional learning is the process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, and establish and maintain positive relationships and make responsible decisions. And how CASEL conceptualizes those are into 5 core, what they call competencies. And that is in that little graphic you see, the colors in the middle. And I'll go through those very quickly, but the first one is self-awareness. That kind of includes things like identifying emotions, understanding self-confidence, recognizing strengths, and that kind of that self-perception. There's social awareness. So that's the ability to take on perspective taking, have empathy, show appreciation for diversity, and having respect for others. Responsible decision making, that includes identifying problems, analyzing situations, reflecting on actions, and then having ethical responsibilities. Self-management includes things like impulse control, stress management, self-discipline, that self-motivation, goal setting, kind of those future things you can think of. And then relationship skills, and that includes communication, social engagement, relationship building, and then teamwork. So those really all encompass, the main things are that it's encompassing relationships, that responsible decision making, and then just understanding emotions. Those are what they can all be kind of consolidated down into. Okay, here. So CASEL also advocates that social emotional learning can be integrated with the behavior and academic MTSS. And then again, we advocate for that crisis piece. But these are the steps that they use to help schools have that integration process. And if you go to that link at the bottom, it actually has questions for each one of these steps that teams can go through and talk about how can they create this SEL support for their schools if they don't have them set already. But for time's sake, I'm just going to go through the steps. So the first one is review what your school or district has established already in terms of academic and behavioral supports. And then how can those align with your SEL goals? The second one is to start with tier 1. We always want to start with tier 1 because it's a universal support for all students. And that includes school climate, evidence-based SEL curriculum and instruction, and then high quality academic instruction that supports that social emotional learning. And then the last step that they advocate for is to integrate that academic and behavioral interventions with SEL. Again, all of it's about integrating. We don't want to do silos. We're past that. We want everything to be integrated, and we want it all to be kind of cohesive and more seamless. And one of the things I highlighted on this one is that they Castle feels it's very important that SEL is not confused with mental and behavioral health interventions, because SEL focuses on the strengths and skills of all students and adults, all students and adults, and those needs that they need throughout their life. It's more those life skills that translate to different environments. And so what they advocate for is that it's different, but it's in combination with those supports that you can really see the best benefit. These next few slides are actual examples of, this one's a state one, a state MTSS system, and the next one is an actual school district. We'll go right back to the first one. Oh, you're good. And so this one's California, and with this one, they included in their MTSS model, they have behavioral and social emotional sports together. So that's kind of where they're integrating them. And it looks like our, academic triangles that you've probably seen before. One of the things I really like about this one, I know the text might be a little small, but on that universal tier 1 support, they address this physiological needs that children need to be able to learn. So they talk about diet and exercise and sleep, and how those are foundations for that all the other learning that happens in the school environment. Now we can go to the next slide. Okay, these next 3 slides are examples from Chicago Public Schools, and I really liked this. It actually comes from a one-pager, and the one-pager is that link at the bottom. And I love this because they not only give ideas of how, what to include in these tiers, but also team decision-making opportunities. So like the first one is establish a team that is dedicated for developing a school climate. So you have a team getting together numerous times a year, talking about how they can improve their school climate. And I like those steps. I won't go through all of these. I'll let you guys read through them, but I'm just going to highlight a few on each tier. So you want to establish routines and transitions, cultivate social emotional learning for adults. So that's something that you really can collaborate with community and parents about how can they support the parents at home, because parents are also providing some of the social emotional learning pieces to their children, and not all do, and not all have those skills. So how can we teach those skills so that students have more skills coming into the school environment? And there's a lot of those school readiness programs out there that kind of help to cultivate that. Let's see, one more on this one. Develop a trauma-sensitive school environment. So that's kind of where it goes into that crisis management piece, is that they're all interconnected in different ways, and that yes, they focus in on one area, but they can be integrated throughout. Next slide, please. Okay, here's tier 2. And then they said that meet as a team to process behavioral health referrals and monitor processes. So again, what we know from a tiered levels of support is you want to be able to look at each tier and what is working and what is not, and then look at what those referrals are and how we can support those students in a more intensified way as we go throughout. Repair and restore positive relationships. So relationships are one of those key foundations that Castle talks about, and we want to make sure that we establish those and maintain them, and then sometimes repair them if they've been broken. And that kind of just goes along with some of my favorite examples are how teachers react to students coming into their classroom, giving them a high five, giving them a hug, just saying good morning and their name, acknowledging that they know who they are. And then provide small group support for students that need focused skill instruction, of course. So it's going to get a little bit more, it's going to get a little smaller in the small groups and really provide those skills that they need that they may not have achieved in that tier 1 level. And then tier 3. And this is individual sports for a few students. And so developing individualized behavioral support plans. So that kind of goes into that behavioral piece, but in that behavioral plan, you can have social emotional learning skills built in, just like in IEPs, you can have different skills that may not, let's say it's an SLD case and it's more academic, but yes, they do have some skill deficits that we could provide more teaching in. And so that's just another piece to that. You can embed community partners within schools. I love that idea. I love that idea of school, family, community, just strengthening all of those relationships, because it takes a village to raise a child. And so it just helps students to see that everyone's working together, and it helps with that positive relationship building, as well as understanding emotions. And then the last one I'll highlight is, well, go ahead. We'll go to the next one. You guys can read those on, but here's our summary, because I really want to get to an opportunity so that you guys can all talk and share feedback. But our summaries are just go with what you know. So let the practice model and existing knowledge guide your approach to crisis response. Remember, everyone is not in the same boat, and then to access, if you need to access needs, use the triage situation. Most people will respond well to social support and psychological education. Identify the opportunities and positives that have come out of this situation. So keep a positive mindset, and then support your students and staff to implement SEL strategies to match the needed level of support. So again, like Erica had mentioned before I spoke, is we have that initial crisis triage, and this social emotional learning will be really important for schools to be able to carry through long-term, and kind of help that sustainability of understanding, helping children to understand their own emotions, so that later, if there is another crisis situation, they might be able to better handle it, given that they've been provided some skills beforehand. And then the last thing I wanted to do is, if you guys know of any good SEL curriculums that your school is using, or ones that you just heard of and that you're looking into, provide them in the chat box. But I think we've only got like 5 minutes left, and I'm sorry. We have a couple things to talk about, and then we can maybe talk about the chat. Okay, I'm done.
All right, so just again, there's the upcoming meeting dates of where those are at. We will also send a save the date information, and to everyone that registered for this, we're gonna send all the resources and PowerPoint that we talked about today, so you guys will have access to that. We had intended to do some questions. I know some of you guys submitted it during registration, which we really appreciated. There's a couple that I want to address right now, and then I'm going to give you guys a think about for next time, because they're really good questions, but I think they apply to some of our other meetings. One, just a basic sort of logistics one. Someone asked about getting CEU credits for this, for NASP certification. Unfortunately, NASP has some pretty high standards for what they count as their CEU credits, and we haven't quite figured out if we can include these meetings. And so the last two will not count, and we can look into the process for the next one, and if we're going to be able to count those, but we'll let you know ahead of time if they will count. And then as far as upcoming questions, we had a really good question from a student asking about what can a first year intern be preparing for next year. So thinking about, they're starting their very first year, but they're starting their very first year after this COVID-19 pandemic. So I think that would be an excellent thing for some people to contribute to in our next meeting, and thinking about what advice would you give to first year or early career school psychologists as they're starting at this process. I'm going to hand it over to, there's all of our contact information, and Jackie has also put that in the chat box as well. So please feel free to email us any questions. The crisis support, Erica and Trisha are there and are able to give you guys support as you need it, and their contact information is there. And finally, we wanted to spend the last couple of minutes telling you guys about our Spotlight for School Psychologist nominations. And Trisha, are you going to talk about that, or is it?
I'm happy to talk about it. I'm not sure who is designated to talk about it.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, since I'm already talking.
Yeah.
So last time we spoke about how we really like to spotlight some school psychologists and what they're doing and what they've done during COVID-19 that really aligns with our NASP practice model. And we were really excited that we've got a few nominations and that we will be announcing soon our first one. And so we want to encourage you all to continue to go to that link, and we'll provide that periodically throughout on social media. And if we want to, and it'll also be in our newsletter at the end of the week. But nominate a fellow colleague or nominate yourself. If you have a really great idea that you use during this time of physical distancing, we'd love to hear about it and we'd love to spotlight you.
Great, thank you, Trisha. And we will, in our weekly emails and on our social media, we've posted that, but we will send it again in our email for this week as well. And if you are not getting those emails and you're wanting to receive them, then email us at OSPA Communications and let us know what email address needs to be on our list. And finally, very last thing is, we want to know if this is beneficial to you. So before you sign off, please, I'm going to have one more poll for you to complete of, is this meeting beneficial to you? And we will end it like that. So we really appreciate you all joining us. If you can complete that poll before you sign off, and we are looking forward to seeing you guys on June 10th. And yes, everything will be sent before the next meeting.